I'm super excited to have you all joining us today for the launch of the first publication of the Municipal Net Zero Action Research Partnership, or N-ZAP for short. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, et merci de vous joindre à nous. Today, I'm very excited to be moderating our webinar on the launch of our new report and database on the state of climate action in Canada. My name is Lindsay Telfer. I use she, her, elle pronouns, and I'm a manager in the Capacity Development Unit with FCM's Green Municipal Fund. I'm a member of the Net Zero Action Research Partnership, and I'm a lead author of the report that we're releasing and discussing today. We are also joined by my colleagues Emma Kirk and Jillian Young with the Green Municipal Fund's Capacity Development Team. They will be on the back end and available to help anyone who needs any technical support. So do reach out using your chat box, and we're there to help you. We also have fantastic speakers from our N-ZAP partnership that are joining today, who I will introduce in just a moment. I'd like to start our session by sharing that I'm joining you all today from the beautiful shorelines of Lake Couchiching and Lake Simcoe on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Huron-Wendat peoples. As a meeting place of two water bodies in central Ontario, this region is often a location of the coming together of peoples. It's not lost on me the significance of this. Never before have human populations needed to come together more in place, in action, and in our research. I extend my own heartfelt thanks to all the ancestors who have cared for this land for generations before my own ancestors arrived here. As an organization, FCM acknowledges with gratitude that our head offices are located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nations in Ottawa. As we move forward with our commitment to reconciliation, we endeavor to unlearn colonial mindsets and practices, to grow in knowledge and to adapt in our ways of working. As we continue to build meaningful relationships, we recognize the historic and ongoing contributions of Indigenous peoples and honor their leadership and partnership in shaping and strengthening our communities across the country. Wherever you are, please join me in paying our respects to the original stewards of this land and committing ourselves to thoughts and actions that will lead to meaningful reconciliation wherever we live and work now. We encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat, and do share if you know where you're joining from in the chat as well as we begin the webinar. Before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping items to get through. Today's event will be in English with French interpretation available. To join the French interpretation, you can click on the interpretation button in the lower right of your screen. Si vous souhaitez écouter en français, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton d'interprétation en bas à droite de votre écran. C'est un petit globe. We also have two separate slide decks in English and en français. See the view options at the top of your screen to switch between those two views. As we move through our presentations today, I ask that you submit your questions using the Q&A box as they come up. We will address some of them during the overall Q&A at the end of our presentations. You are welcome to ask questions throughout the chat box during the presentations and in the language of your choice. We will keep an eye out for clarification questions that can be addressed during the presentations. On our next slide, we'll go over an agenda for the webinar. I will kick us off with a very brief introduction to N-ZAP partnership, and then we'll hand it over to our guest speakers. After their presentations, we'll move into that open Q&A, offering you a chance to ask any of the questions that arise for you. Before we get into our presentations, I just wanted to give a quick introduction. The Municipal Net Zero Action Research Partnership is a research partnership funded in part by the Government of Canada through the Climate Action and Awareness Fund, and jointly led by the University of Waterloo, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Green Municipal Fund, and ICLEI Canada. We're working alongside 11 other academic institutions, 8 national organizations, and 13 municipal partners, and a few of which you'll get to hear from today. N-ZAP aims to study and create improved methods for how local governments monitor, measure, and reduce our local greenhouse gas emissions. These evaluation methods will make it easier for municipalities to identify, develop, and assess decarbonization initiatives. with the goal of aligning our local climate work with national commitments. As an academic practitioner research collaboration, N-ZAP facilitates the knowledge transfer of academic scientific information to municipal practitioners, bridging the gap between practice and theoretical work. As the project bridges this gap, N-ZAP acknowledges that there are many other gaps that exist in our climate action work that need bridging, including gaps in how reconciliation, anti-racism, equity, and inclusion show up in our work or not, who is engaged in the conversations and research, and who is meaningfully a part of the planning and action of climate action on the ground. We commit to challenging our research, our colleagues, and our products to advance the integration of reconciliation, anti-racism, equity, and inclusion principles into all that we do. And we further commit to openness and learning in areas where it's identified that we can and need to do better. Now I would like to pass it over to Megan Meany, our first speaker. Megan is the Executive Director of ICLEI Canada, and along with FCM and the University of Waterloo, is a project lead for this initiative. Megan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Meany. I'm with ICLEI Canada, and my pronouns are she, her. ICLEI is an international association of local governments committed to sustainability, and I'm the executive director of our Canada operations. I'm calling in from Toronto today, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now gratefully home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So when Lindsay first introduced N-ZAP, she mentioned it's a collaboration between 11 academic institutions, 8 national organizations, and 13 municipal partners. It truly is an action research partnership. We've got so many partners with diverse backgrounds playing a role in scoping and shaping the research and the research outputs. So you can see many of those partner logos on the screen now. I've been in this field for 25 years. I can honestly say I've never seen such a meaningful collaboration between the municipal climate practitioners and the research community. It's a collaboration that benefits both the researchers and the practitioners, and it's built on a foundation of real mutual interest and respect, and striving to meet Canada's net zero goals. So I'm really moved and inspired to be a part of it. Next slide. The main goal of our project is to support Canadian municipalities to monitor, measure, and achieve their mitigation goals. We aim to ensure emission reduction projects and policies and programs are aligned with Canada's national reduction commitments. The project is studying and creating improved measurement, analysis, and monitoring systems for both municipal and community-wide emissions to advance the quantification of emissions, enable the application of methods to identify mitigation opportunities, and evaluate their effectiveness. So ultimately, this will augment national reporting processes and align with international practice. You might recognize the focus of this effort and the branding of the publication and the slide deck as being PCP, or Partners for Climate Protection. That's because the early efforts for this research came through collaborations between PCP and University of Waterloo, and the outputs of this research will be hosted by the PCP through our network, our community of practice, our tools, and our website. And you'll see more about this as I speak further. Next slide. In this upcoming slide, here we go, you can see a visualization of N-ZAP's objectives, methods, and outputs. We've organized ourselves into 5 working groups where all our municipal, research, and NGO partners are playing different roles, chairing working groups and providing all sorts of insights and direction. In working group 1, along the top horizontal bar there, our focus is on determining the current state of emission reduction targets, measurement, monitoring, and planning in Canadian municipalities. So that's what you've come here to learn about today. Very shortly you will. In working group 2, here we're focused on advancing standardized measurement systems and tools that can be used to identify mitigation opportunities and further social equity. So we're developing a new suite of complementary indicators related to transportation and carbon sinks, social equity, and the green economy. And we're building these indicators into the PCP tool to help municipalities track and operationalize them. In working group 3, the third horizontal bar there, we're focused on enhancing municipal monitoring and disclosure and integrating net zero accounting and climate budgets into municipal level decision making to enhance transparency on actions and gaps and drive planning to close those gaps. And of course, provide accountability. So here we're focused on developing 2 guidebooks, a climate budgeting guidebook. We'll look at what it is, how it's being used to date, and how you might apply it in a small and medium municipality. We're also developing a climate-related financial disclosures guidebook. So how does it relate to local governments? How have the disclosures that have been completed in the past, what direction can they help us take in the future? And how can a medium municipality learn from the experience of Canada's larger municipalities in this space? So if you could just please go back one more slide. The methods applied in these 2 guidebooks will be incorporated into the PCP tool to help municipalities, again, operationalize them. In working group 4, we're working to advance community-wide emissions measuring and monitoring through collaborative governance. And we want to ensure equitable, diverse, and inclusive engagement in climate action measurement and monitoring. So we're producing another guide here on collaborative governance that will provide guidance and case studies from our research on diverse and inclusive climate action measurement and reporting. And then last but not least, working group 5. This will focus on knowledge mobilization and the tools to engage diverse audiences using accessible and inclusive formats. We've dedicated a lot of time in this project to mobilizing the knowledge gained through the research, through pilots, through community of practice, webinars, workshops like this. If this webinar is the first time you're hearing from us, that's understandable. Today we're launching the first product. You can expect to hear much more from us in the coming years as more and more of our research is completed and the deliverables are ready for mobilization. Next slide. Here you'll see our project timeline. This is a 6-year project and we've just entered year 3. Year 1 focused on laying the foundation with literature reviews and survey development and case study identification. Year 2, many of you participated in our survey that informed the launch today. There was also case study interviews and research and lots of building of the database in the background. Year 3, we're focused on finalizing the 3 guides and the PCP tool upgrades to help municipalities operationalize them. Year 4 is promoting the deliverables and beginning the knowledge mobilization. And then year 5, we're going to really get out into the field and focus on training, as well as repeating the survey to see if we can measure any progress over time. And then, of course, in year 6 is where we wrap up. And then all of the deliverables, all of the tools and knowledge will live within the PCP network and on the PCP website for others to gain from. Next slide. And this is my last slide. You can see here our engagement profile. All the numbers we're working towards hitting as we engage in this research and then mobilize our learning. I'd like to draw your attention to that number 250 right in the middle. This is how many communities we want to see put our guides and tools to the test. None of this kind of work is static. We're working in a pretty fast-paced, quickly evolving space. And, it's action research, which is by definition action-oriented. So we want to follow your experience and action and ensure they are incorporated into our findings. So you'll hear more opportunities to engage with us in this research as a pilot community, more at the end of this webinar, and through the communications from the 3 core partners. So please stay tuned on that. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your interest in N-ZAP. Look forward to many more opportunities to connect, and I'll pass it back over to our moderator, Lindsay, to continue with today's webinar.
Thanks, Megan. A great overview on the deep work of the N-ZAP partnership and some good teasers of what's going to come next. Now we're going to turn our attention to the second presentation today, and that really is the content of the research and survey that we just completed and launched. This will be from our two of our lead authors of the report, I'd like to introduce Dr. Adrienne McDonald and Ying Zhao. Dr. McDonald is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Governance and Sustainability at Concordia University. And Ying is a PhD candidate in Sustainability Management at the University of Waterloo. Adrienne and Ying, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to you all for joining us today. I think I can speak on behalf of the entire N-ZAP team when I say that we are incredibly excited to be sharing the preliminary results of our survey on the state of climate action in Canadian municipalities. My name is Adrienne McDonald. I'm an associate professor of management and Canada Research Chair in Governance and Sustainability at Concordia University. My pronouns are she, her, elle, and I'm joining you from Montreal, Canada, located on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I'm presenting today with my co-author, Ying Zhao. I'll let her briefly introduce herself.
Perfect. Thank you, Adrienne. So hello, everyone. My name is Ying Zhou, and my pronouns are she, her, elle. So as Lindsay introduced, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo, and I'm joining you today from Waterloo, Ontario. And our university is located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people.
Thank you, Ying. Next slide, please. So in June 2023, we launched a survey aimed at determining the state of climate action planning and implementation in municipalities across Canada. Before this survey, information about municipal climate action in Canada was somewhat abundant, but fragmented. There had not been a comprehensive nationwide study that could act as a benchmark and measure progress on local climate action as we move towards Canada's target of net zero by 2050. So recognizing this gap, N-ZAP, our N-ZAP team believed that this was a crucial starting point for us, as well as just in general, to systematically assess local climate action initiatives in Canada. So our survey concluded in September 2023 and received 256 responses from municipalities, representing 69.5% of the Canadian population. As Megan mentioned, looking ahead, we plan to conduct the same survey in 2027 to assess progress. Next slide, please. So just briefly, this slide summarizes the percentage of survey respondents by province, which shows that we have fairly proportional representation from each province. Next slide. Our first pass at analyzing the data for the report, which is primarily descriptive and really, in my mind, just the beginning or just sort of the tip of the iceberg on what we plan to do with this database, but it revealed 5 key areas for improvement. Ying and I are now going to provide an overview of the results that contributed to these conclusions. However, one of the things that we really want to encourage you to do is review the report as well, because it provides a far more detailed account of these findings and the conclusions. Next slide. So one of the first things we looked at was emissions reduction target setting in municipalities. Next slide, please. Of the 256 municipalities that responded to our survey, 139 reported having a corporate community or combined corporate community target. Next slide, please. What we find is that 131 communities have a corporate greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. And of these, 62 have set a target of net zero by 2050. We also found that 119 communities have a community target, and of these, 55 have set a target of net zero by 2050. One of the things I find really encouraging here is that 78% of the larger centers, so those with populations of over 100,000, reported having a corporate target. Also, 76% have a community target. So this is really critical because these larger centers also are responsible for a larger share of the emissions than smaller centers. Next slide, please. So on the one hand, I think it's really great news that a good number of cities have set net zero by 2050 targets, and that most of these municipalities have populations of over 100,000 for greater impact. On the other hand, we can always do better, right? It's been almost exactly 3 years since Canada set its sights on reaching net zero by 2050. So naturally, getting municipalities of all sizes to align with this ambitious and relatively new target is going to require additional investment and support. And that's why we're calling for a more concerted effort from all stakeholders, including higher levels of government, to drive the adoption of emissions reduction targets that align with Canada's net zero by 2050 goal. Next slide, please. The next thing we looked at was greenhouse gas emissions inventories. So really looking to better understand the measurement and monitoring of greenhouse gases in a municipal context. Next slide, please. And here we find that 136 municipalities have a greenhouse gas inventory. Again, in general, with the greatest proportion of these being larger centers. Of course, this isn't particularly surprising, as larger centers will have more resources and capacity for these kinds of undertakings. Next slide, please. On this slide, what we can see is corporate inventories are more common than community inventories, which is what we would expect, given that many municipalities begin their climate action planning journey first with a corporate and then later adding a community level. Next slide. And what we're looking at with this graphic is the frequency of how frequently municipalities are updating their inventories. So here we see that municipalities tend to complete regular updates on their corporate and also combined inventories, whereas community inventories are updated much less frequently, if at all, perhaps due to the availability of data. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we see the estimated changes in greenhouse gas emissions. So essentially what we wanted to know is, are municipalities meeting their targets or not? And we find that across all three categories, corporate, community, and combined, that many municipalities are unsure of where they're at with respect to progress on emissions reductions. And then we just have a very small group reaching or making meaningful progress on their targets. Next slide, please. So encouragingly, the survey findings revealed a considerable number of Canadian municipalities already possess greenhouse gas emissions inventories, with corporate inventories being the most prevalent. However, approximately half of the participating municipalities had yet to develop a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and this signals the need for additional support and capacity building in this particular dimension of climate action. Next slide, please. So we also looked at what stakeholders and rights holders municipalities were engaging in their climate action planning and implementation, as well as the extent to which they were engaging these groups. So for example, we wanted to know if municipalities were simply providing information about their climate action planning to stakeholders, or really seeking partnerships and other collaborative opportunities in their engagement with their stakeholders and rights holders. Next slide. Here we can see that in general, municipalities tend to include internal stakeholders such as internal staff or elected officials in their climate action decision-making through empowerment or collaboration. On the other hand, what we also see with this graphic is that municipalities are less likely to have those meaningful stakeholder engagement interactions with external groups. So in particular, a large number of municipalities do not engage external local rights holders. So what's in this grouping are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments and individuals. Next slide, please. So this data suggests that there's a real need for municipalities to invest in fostering partnerships with a wider diversity of stakeholders and rights holders groups in their climate action planning and implementation. Okay, that's it for me. We'll hear from Ying now. Thank you.
Perfect. So next slide, please. So the 256 participating municipalities, as you will see in the report, are fairly equally distributed by size. So here we have looked at the variations in terms of climate action planning and implementation across these municipalities. Next slide. So overall, 63.3% had implemented a climate action plan. Although roughly 37% has yet to develop a plan, over half of them reporting having taken action toward developing one. So this include initiating the planning process, allocating staff and budget, and integrating across different teams and departments. We have also found that 75.2% of municipalities with a climate action plan has set GHG emission targets. Next slide. So these pie charts here shows the detailed breakdown of climate action plan type by population size. We can see here that our larger cities are leading in climate action planning, but there are also commendable efforts from the small and mid-sized municipalities. So there are noticeable differences in terms of preferred plan type among large and small municipalities. Larger municipalities typically have a combined climate action plan for their corporate and community GHG emissions, or both corporate and community plans as separate plans. Whereas the smaller municipalities, especially those with a population less than 10,000, have another type of plan. So these typically are local action plans, municipal energy plans, etc. So next slide. So here is the snapshot by province. You can see that in most provinces, over 70% of municipalities have either implemented a climate action plan or are actively working toward developing one. Next slide. So summarizing our result, many larger Canadians are in fact leaders in climate mitigation, while most smaller ones are in the early stages of climate action. Of municipalities that have yet to undertake any climate action planning, 34 of them are in fact small municipalities. So this signals that smaller municipalities requires more tailored support for taking action. Nonetheless, continuous effort in terms of increasing staff support and funding streams to accelerate local climate actions are needed for municipalities of all sizes. Next slide, please. So we just briefly talked about climate planning and implementation in general, but our survey also focused on uncovering some of the specific climate intervention adopted by municipalities. Next slide. As you can see from this slide and the next, most municipalities prioritize climate mitigation actions in the building, transportation, energy, and waste activity sectors in both their corporate and community plans. So the column on the right here listed the most frequently adopted corporate GHG reduction interventions among the survey communities. We have also provided specific examples of these intervention types in the report, so be sure to take a look there. Next slide, please. Oh, the previous slide, thank you. So in contrast, you can see for community emission activity sectors, industrial processes and product use, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses were the sectors that reported least by the participating municipalities. Here again, on the right column, are the most frequently adopted community GHG reduction intervention types among the surveyed municipalities. Next slide. So in order to align interventions with the net zero targets set by local municipalities, these more support and guidance are necessary for municipalities to undertake robust intervention within each activity sector that might be beyond their direct control. It is also essential to identify and consciously prioritize the different municipal projects, programs, intervention that foster deep emission reduction. And lastly, we need to collectively work together to develop research-informed materials, tools, training programs to enhance our understanding of the interventions and the different measures that contribute most to achieving net zero emission targets. Next slide. So overall, Adrian and I, we have collectively highlighted these 5 crucial gaps for accelerating local climate action toward net zero. Next slide. And I want to conclude by acknowledging that Canadian municipalities are in fact making progress toward reducing emissions. They're officially adopting GHG reduction targets. They're developing climate actions or equivalent plans and addressing a diverse range of activity sectors within their community. And a subset of them are also taking a leadership role in the measurement and monitoring efforts for tracking progress toward net zero. We hope our reporting findings will empower municipalities and those who are supporting them to advance local climate mitigation efforts and foster impactful climate reductions. Next slide. So finally, a huge thank you to all the municipalities that have participated in our survey.
Thanks, Yang, and thanks, Adrian. That was a lot of information shared in a short time. Some great information there. People were asking for the slides. All of the data that was shared with you in those slides today is available directly in the report, the link of which is in the webinar chat. I think a few times I've seen it pop up, so certainly go there, and all of those graphs and all of that information and then some and some more are included in that report. I now want to move to our third speaker and turn it over to Ian McVeigh with the region of Durham. Ian is the manager of sustainability with the region and also a member of our N-ZAP project committee and working groups. Ian, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and hello, everyone. I am joining you here from the North Shores of Lake Ontario as a representative of Durham Region, so land that's governed by or covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Agreement, so a commitment to share the land and waters between Indigenous communities and settlers. We are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat, and currently covered by the Williams Treaties, which include the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, Georgina Island, the Chippewas of Georgina, Hiawatha, Curve Lake, Alderville, and Rama and Beausoleil. I think that's it. We've got 7 First Nations communities governed by the Williams Treaty. So there's a rich history of meeting and exchange here in this part of the country, in the Great Lakes region, between First Nations and settlers, and that we strive to continue that spirit of meeting and exchange in this current era of reconciliation and in a spirit of mutual aid as we confront some of these existential challenges like climate change. On the next slide, I thought the point would be made, but I'm going to make the point that we are critical actors. I guess if you're here, you understand that local governments are critical actors in the fight against climate change. While we typically represent less than 5% of emissions emitted within a given territory, most of those emissions are in the most critical services. You can see here: water, clean water, wastewater treatment, solid waste management, police, paramedics, transit. So emissions that we we can decarbonize, but often hard to decarbonize when we look at some of the water, wastewater treatment for sure. But as well, we have significant influence over emissions within the community, in particular buildings and transportation, when we look at land use planning and infrastructure planning. So we are really important, and what we do matters. On the next slide, I'm just going to sort of walk through some of the key topics or themes within the report. And I'm going to try to slow down a little bit for our translators and the French audience. So We typically, or the report, and we typically think about the two domains, corporate and community. I really want to make the point that those are strategically linked. They're not two solitudes, as we think about French and English, perhaps. And really, if a municipality wants to influence the community to do something, it's really helpful to show that you are doing it yourself. So walking the talk, demonstrating community leadership, so that, corporate action really important. I'm sure that goes without saying. The question and the challenge I think we face is how to set the target. And do you take a science-based net zero target, net zero by 2050, or more of a bottom-up achievable potential, what's within a given building, a given asset class, what is achievable within a 5-10 year time frame. So I think those are sort of the two approaches I've seen, and they can of course coexist, which is really the approach that we've taken in Durham Region. I think what really matters, certainly the aspirational target matters, but I think in some ways more important are the near-term targets. And I would say near-term targets that are aligned with terms of council or multi-year budget cycles or strategic planning cycles, often in our case, a 4-year, 5-year strategic planning cycle, to help align accountability and transparency for action. So we've tried to align our targets with our budget and strategic planning cycle, so that we can motivate change within departments in a near-term basis rather than having that long-term target that people might not believe is realistic. I think it's really important as well to sort of prioritize those opportunities that utilize municipal infrastructure to enable community decarbonization. I talked about those hard to abate municipal emission sources. So district energy is something we're really interested in looking at from our solid waste management and from our wastewater treatment. Renewable natural gas is another one of those opportunities. So just want to really highlight that as something that we're looking at as an opportunity to, utilize strategically that interplay between corporate and community. Of course, we are not an island as a corporation, as a municipal corporation within the community. On the next slide, I'm going to share some reflections on GHG inventories, starting with corporate inventories. We do have we're lucky. I've been in this role for about 5 years, but we have a long history of corporate GHG tracking going well before me in our finance department. And that's really been a strategic role there, having that carbon accounting expertise. And we really, in my tenure, centered that work within our business planning and budgets process and with our annual reporting to council. We have annual updates to council on our corporate progress and with forecasting relative to the targets, the near-term targets that council has approved. You can see there in that chart an example of what we reported recently to our council. And the news isn't great. We're not aligned with our 2025 or 2030 target. But the fact of that and the transparency of that is something that's a helpful tool to sort of put fire under people's butts, if you will. I think there are on tap when we think about capacity needs and what the sector needs. I would suggest there is a need for more templated tools around GHG inventories. We have one, and I've shared it with others. But I think to enable that consistency and comparison and avoid having to reinvent the wheel, a templated Excel spreadsheet tool, it could be helpful. Maybe that's something we could talk about further if the tool that Durham uses is fit for purpose. As well, I think Scope 3 emissions guidance is something that we have on our radar, keeps coming up, but we haven't really yet had the capacity to act on. So I'm thinking contracted services. We outsource our waste collection. For example, employee commuting is something we aren't tracking on an annual basis. So there's some of the examples. On the next slide, a few reflections on community GHG inventories. And I think, as you saw, the survey found that most municipalities didn't update those inventories regularly. Data gaps are a big reason. It's often modeled or estimated data based on StatsCan census data updated every 4 years. So, how useful is that for real-term planning? It's questionable. And as well, we have limited staff capacity to compile inventories. And so I would argue rightfully we are prioritizing implementation rather than carbon accounting at the staff level, maybe. And this is I mean, we're in Durham region, we're in the Greater Toronto area, relatively, I would, we have maybe more staff than others, I guess, maybe more emissions than others as well. Nonetheless, often another reason is that the comparability of community inventories is often not possible due to different methodologies, which again limits the utility of it. So we've been really fortunate in the GTA to have the Atmospheric Fund, TAF, and their Greater Toronto and Hamilton area carbon inventory that's updated annually that compares us against the other 905, upper tier regional municipalities and Toronto. We're also working with our local university, Ontario Tech, to develop some inventories within Durham region that compare our local municipalities. So I would encourage that, whether if you don't have a TAF or an academic partner, even looking at a county or regional district and collaborating that way. On the next slide, I'm going to share some reflections on climate action planning. Again, we've got maybe a longer history than some. Our first action plan was endorsed by Council in 2012, long before I was in this seat, what I call our first generation plan, which I would, I'd say had limited success due to insufficient resource allocation. We then had our second generation plan, our Durham Community Energy Plan, approved by Council in 2018. It was actually developed more in 2016. Developed as a community plan in collaboration with our municipalities and our utilities, meant to be jointly implemented. You can see here a chart showing some of the key strategies within our low carbon pathway. Importantly, this plan featured an economic analysis of costs and benefits, and really articulated the economic opportunity from the clean energy transition. And that remains a helpful narrative framing for us, for staff, when going to council, to stakeholders, to make the case for the implementation of initiatives for resourcing, et cetera. So that's something that was a benefit from the second generation of planning. However, there remain some gaps. There was no equity lens, limited to no Indigenous community engagement. Again, it was 2015, 2016. The world has changed a lot in a relatively short time. And of course, while it was important then, it's even more important now. So it's something we're dealing with at the moment in terms of how we maybe retrofit our plan. On the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit about what I might be called third generation climate action planning. I think it's important, and we're seeing this move from a niche exercise to an integral part of land use, energy, and transportation planning. Really important that we provide a spatial or geographic lens to what net zero means in our community. And really important that we coordinate with utility partners, in particular our electric utilities, which in Ontario are municipally owned for a large part. In Durham, they are. And so our Durham Community Energy Plan has an aspirational target and a net zero pathway, but it says nothing to the utility about where solar is going to come, where heat pumps are likely to come, where we're going to see EV uptake. And so it's really hard for them to translate that aspirational target into a demand forecast and an infrastructure plan that they can take to the regulator to get capital allocated. So I think we're seeing now some real gaps between what we're planning that we need to leap over so that we can make sure that these plans are implementable. I'm going to move on from this slide just because I'm running out of time. And thank you, Emma, for the warning. A bit deeper on the next slide, if you will, this slide, on maybe more of what we've been missing. So I mentioned that equity lens, and of course, over the past 6 months, a year, 2 years, the question of how do we align climate action with affordability has become almost the burning issue, as the Axe the Tax campaign and the narrative more generally is getting tougher around this. I would encourage folks to look at the Housing Task Force report, co-chaired by Don Iveson and Lisa Raitt, cross-partisan, for some actionable recommendations on aligning climate and housing policies. Super important for us in Durham and the GTHA. I'd say we've been really focused on energy, and the survey results back that up, energy-related emissions, but I think perhaps neglecting the land-based emissions, agriculture, forestry, et cetera, which of course has interplay with sprawl and land use. And I think by not including that, we've been missing an opportunity to build alliances maybe with some unusual, unlikely suspects. And I think at the moment I'm seeing some of the blowback from, for example, the agriculture community of feeling left out of some of the municipal and even other senior levels of government from climate action planning. They're only seeing the stick, the costs. Indigenous engagement remains a challenge, and I think they're feeling pulled in many directions and don't have a lot of capacity themselves. They're often working through consultants to support them, and so incorporating costs into our budget so we can, make sure that we can pay the consultants that they need to provide us their perspectives is going to be really important. We're seeing time delays on critical infrastructure projects when this is missed. Embodied carbon is a big issue. It's not a horizon issue. It's here that I think as we look at the housing push, how we do that in a way that doesn't blow the carbon budget, I think is, I don't have the answer. It's just something that, we need to keep on the radar. And I think this is the last, I've got another minute or so. The next slide, it's actually 2 more slides, but I'm going to be quick. Corporate emissions, we are a housing authority, we're very much focused on affordable housing and long-term care. So trying to align equity, vulnerable people, and our climate action through the housing and transit fleet. There's a lot of priorities on the community side. We've been focused on building energy retrofits, green development standards for new housing construction, district energy, leveraging our municipal heat sources. And in the final 30 seconds, I'm going to revert back to the final slide around why we're really important in this and critical actors. We've done a lot of work, again, trying to retrofit our plan for equity lens, and we did a social network analysis that looked at surveyed organizations and stakeholders and rights holders throughout the region around who they think about when they think about issues relating to energy, costs, affordability, and really the outcome was that local governments, and in our case the region in particular, are seen by many actors across the region as having really the key role in coordinating that network and helping to support collaboration between actors. So that's my final slide, except for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. And that social network analysis map really does show just how central municipalities are, and definitely part of the reason this was such a big and important research and work that we're setting off on. So thank you. Lots of recognitions there and some really good questions coming through, many of which were answered directly. I'm going to pull out a couple just to kickstart our Q&A period. So please do go to that Q&A box and add any other questions that you're sitting with that you'd like to put forward for consideration. I want to start and draw out the question that I saw, Adrian, I think maybe you answered it directly, which was about how does the city advance the community portion of emission reductions? And I thought it was maybe a good opportunity to talk a little bit more about our interventions section of the report and any sort of high-level findings that emerged in that, and maybe a little plug to some research that I know is coming down the pipe. So Adrian, maybe that question over to you.
Yeah, sure. So some kind of interesting things that we're seeing in that section of the survey is, I'd say anecdotally speaking, municipalities tend to be far more advanced on the corporate side than the community side of things. So for example, we have 151 municipalities having plans to recommission or conduct energy retrofits on existing municipal owned buildings. 117 have plans to install on-site renewable energy, and 72 are planning to install distributed renewable energy generation on city facilities. These aren't the top ones, but these are the ones that I thought, there's a sizable number that are doing like pretty advanced things from the corporate side of things. When it comes to the community initiatives, after educational programs, there seems to be more of an emphasis on public investments. So for example, we have 137 municipalities having plans to invest in improved infrastructure for zero emissions vehicles. 136 have plans to invest in non-motorized transport infrastructure, and 52 have plans to invest in renewable energy supply at the community level. So that sort of stood out for me as like some interesting, a bit more advanced kinds of interventions that municipalities are working on right now. And then just quickly, there is a report that I mentioned in the Q&A by Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and all throughout the report, they list several different kinds of interventions that can be done at both the community and corporate level for each of the activity sectors: transportation, building, energy, etc. I put the link in the Q&A, so if anybody who's interested in that, and that report informed a number of the interventions that we put on our survey. I'm good. I better stop talking so that I give other people a chance.
Thank
I could
you.
share a couple of
Yeah,
thoughts
Ian,
on that.
go
I mean,
ahead.
I think in
Please
some
do.
ways it's opportunistic too, right? So I think about, you know, we are running a home energy retrofit program through the region. That is because FCM has the community efficiency financing program. We probably wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't for the investment through the Green Municipal Fund. Similarly, on the EV charging infrastructure, public facing, it's the NRCan Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program that's got healthy funding. So I think often it's, well, of course, there are plans that point to things, but then there's the funding that comes to enable opportunistically us to go after that. So just a couple, maybe an additional thought there.
Yeah, thanks, Ian.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to pull out another question here, and I might direct this, Ying, towards you to maybe share a little bit more on our data collection approach to this. The question was, to what extent are the survey results skewed towards those that are climate active? And I thought that maybe some of our methodology and recruitment of survey responses might help answer that. But over to you. Can I invite you to share a little more there?
So in terms of, oh, sorry. So as you can see from where in our report and from our presentation, that there are still a number of municipalities that have yet to take any actions. So based on the distributions, we have those that are taking leaders, and we have those that are taking initiating toward climate action planning, and those are still at the early stages. So our participating municipalities are from all various stages of climate action and toward the net zero transition. I think we haven't. I would say that we tried very actively in being neutral and open up the survey to the participating municipalities and done a wonderful job of kind of recruiting these municipalities. So the 256 municipalities represents around approximately 70% of the Canadian population. So I think it is a fairly depicts a fairly accurate representation in terms of geographic variations across different provinces and the population representation across Canada. Adrian, do you want to add anything in terms of
Giving Adrian a chance to jump in. Maybe what I might add and offer to that as well is, as we had a summer of co-op students who reached out and called many communities who had not yet responded to the survey, and so we were really proactive about reaching communities and engaging communities throughout that result or collection phase. So I think there was some broad attempts there to get beyond just the climate active. A question for you, Ian. People are wanting to know more about Durham's third generation plan. Can you share a little more about that?
Sure. I saw that question from Stephanie. Hello, Stephanie. Yeah, that is not a plan I have a link for. It's really a work, like something I'm working on currently, and it's, you know, in our case, it's driven by our local distribution companies needing, our electricity distribution companies needing to develop a load forecast, a 20-year load forecast. And they said to me, tell us how your net zero target is going to be achieved. And I was like, don't know, can't help you, need to help you. Let's figure out how we're going to work on this together. And so that's what it's been more of a recent, well, I wouldn't say recent realization, but it's become put on my plate that we need to look at more spatial infrastructure planning to translate net zero into something that can be actioned by our partner agencies. And I would put the same thing to, from transit and land use planning, that we're not quite there yet in terms of having the answers for partners in terms of how those targets will be achieved, what projects and initiatives and where. So sorry, Stephanie, I don't have anything to share, but it's a work in progress.
Great.
Maybe I would say like Greater Ottawa, because they've been through this electricity planning process sort of a stage ahead of us. And I've been really leaning on them and some of their Hydro Ottawa and the City of Ottawa's work to develop a load forecast, a demand forecast that aligns with net zero. Maybe I could share some links to that work in the chat now.
Great. Thanks, Ian. I want to draw a last question that I might draw out in this section of the webinar. Are any of you aware of municipalities engaging with local Indigenous communities on climate action plans? And I pulled open the report to look at the engagement and stakeholders, rights holders section, and certainly there are. There were a number of municipalities who said that they are collaborating and empowering involvement of I say a number, it was about 32, so low necessarily in this, there's lots of room for improvement there, but there certainly are some that are identifying it. I don't know, Adrian, Ying, if either of you have any other reflections on that. We don't list the municipalities per se, but yeah, invite you to comment.
Well, we can't disclose specific communities who are engaging these groups because it's just because of research ethics. But what I can say is something that Working Group 4 we'll be looking at is a bit more of this topic. And so they'll be doing case studies, and in those case studies, they'll be going into a lot more detail, talking about how the partnerships that they study, partnerships and municipalities engage in Indigenous groups. So there'll be a lot more detail there. So just stay tuned to some of the research outputs of Working Group 4, where that's something we'll be looking at more.
And also I want to,
sorry.
also I want to add that I guess just a heads up for our next webinar launch for the database. So a portion of these municipality has opted into having the data publicized. So they will share that we have a list of their plans. So in their plans, they might highlight whether or not they're working with these Indigenous groups, and you might find examples of these partnerships and maybe projects.
I was just going to add that in the PCP, we just released 2 case studies on municipal Indigenous community collaborations on climate action. So there's a Georgian Bay, Eastern Georgia Bay, I believe, highlight, and then a Greater Sudbury highlight. So I'll link, I think the Georgian Bay one's up on the website now, and the Sudbury one is coming a little later. So I'll link the one that's available now, and just stay tuned to the PCP news to see the other one.
Great. Thanks all, and some good plugs to other information out
and
there.
We've been doing something with our Indigenous partners I could share, Lindsay.
Please. Yes, please.
Yeah, so through our Durham Greener Homes, our home retrofit program, we sought funding through NRCan for basically a virtual home energy auditing tool. And through our partner, Windfall Ecology Center, and we've with them are working with the Williams Treaty First Nations to apply that virtual home energy auditing tool to the homes in their communities, which are often of a similar age and vintage. So that sort of virtual tool can be, perhaps more insightful than communities that have a very different housing archetypes. So there's been, it's been some good partnerships there on the home energy side of things that have been great to see, but definitely challenging to get their attention and interest in this, again, given the wide number of requests that they face. So just as I said in my talk. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ian, for sharing that. And more information and more research to come.